Hello, welcome back. If you're new here, my name is Becca and today I'm going to be talking about my reading journey. So, by reading journey, I mean I'm going to be talking about how I started off reading and sort of pivotal books in my reading journey and what they meant to me. Now, just so that you're aware, these are not necessarily going to be good books, so it's not going to be like I read Jane Eyre and it changed my life and I was sort of switched on to literary masterpieces. That is not going to happen. There's a lot of YA, a lot of children's books, and just generally books that I remember that sort of changed the course of my reading through time. Okay, so we're going to start off right at the beginning with my toddler years. Now, I hear a lot from my mum that I first became a reader before I could read. And by that, what she means is instead of me playing with toys or doing things that I guess normal children did, I would go to the magazine rack on a night when I was looking for things to entertain myself, and I would pull out catalogues and I would flip through them and just look at the pictures. So straight from being a toddler, I always had some sort of book in my hand, even if I couldn't read it. Moving on from there, the books that I remember my mum reading to me when I was a kid was the famous 5 books by Enid Blyton. I will insert a picture here. There was also The Secret Seven, and I remember one Enid Blyton book in particular about a toy box that I really enjoyed. I do still have all of these books, but they're in storage and I was too lazy to get them. They're not even like super in storage either, like they're pretty accessible but just not in the house. So I'll just insert a picture, and I remember her reading this to me because I have older parents, and so that was something that my mum remembered from her childhood. And these are sort of like the famous 5 series are action adventure novels with a group of 4 children and a dog, and sort of like old school Scooby-Doo. They were a little bit detective-y as well, and I have really early memories of my mum reading those to me, and she'd sit in her armchair and I would sit on the arm of it and sort of lean into her as she read to me. Moving on from there, I don't think any reading journey would be complete without Harry Potter by J.K. Rowling. I came onto these quite late. I think I started reading them just before Order of the Phoenix came out. So I read the first 4 books, and then Order of the Phoenix was probably the first book that I remember being bought for me as it came out, and I just completely flew through them. I have a really early childhood memory, and there are spoilers here for Order of the Phoenix. Somebody in my school, like when we were changing our shoes in primary school, it was the day after the book had been released, and he was like, "Oh, I've read it already, Sirius dies at the end." And I was like, "No, he doesn't, don't be ridiculous." And of course, we all know what actually happens, so I have a very vivid memory of that. And the funny thing about me and Harry Potter is that although it is very special to me, I have never reread it, and that's something I want to do this year. But Harry Potter for me is pure nostalgia and just really takes me back to my childhood and it being a standout series that I really remember. Another really early childhood thing I have is we had 2 dogs, we had 2 Rottweilers, and they had baskets in the hallway where they used to sleep, and we had this really huge scary Rottweiler, and I used to go and sit on top of her in her basket and read books to her, and that was pretty much what I would do every night when I did learn to read. So that's a really fond memory that I have. But when I started going to the library, I was already a devourer of books. So I would go to the library, and the limit of the amount of books I could have out was 12. I would go on a Wednesday after school, I would get 12 books out, I would take them home, and I would read them before the following Wednesday and really want to go back, but my mum was like, "No, we only go on Wednesdays." It didn't matter what it was. I would go to the library and I would pick up the 5th book in a series just because I hadn't read it and take it home and read that. And it wasn't so much about what I was reading at the time, it was just about reading. So shortly after that, I'm not sure where I discovered these books, but it came to me owning my own books, and this was very early on in high school. So one of the first books that I remember really enjoying and owning for myself is Angus Thongs and Full Frontal Snogging by Louise Renison. This is the first book in the Georgia Nicholson series. Now, if you are from the US, I believe that they changed the name of a lot of these books, but they did do a film as well, so you may have heard of them. But they are very British books, and they are about a 13-year-old girl called Georgia Nicholson and her friends and her obsession with this older boy called Robbie. Through the series, it evolves and she's obsessed with an Italian guy named Massimo, and she has a friend called Dave the Laugh. And the thing that gets me about these books is I stopped reading as much when the last book came out and I never read it. I never figured out which guy she chose. So now I have all the books and I want to reread them at some point, and I know they're going to be terrible because they're written in like a diary entry style from a 13-year-old girl. But I need to know how this series ends because this was literally like my life. There are a lot of made up words in this series and I used to say them like they were part of my vocabulary, and I also remember recommending these to my friends at school who then borrowed them off me and read them and absolutely loved them. So that was one of my first experiences of sharing the love of reading with somebody else who wasn't as much of a reader as I was. At around the same time I discovered Meg Cabot. Now this is the first book in the Missing series because sadly I gave away a lot of my Meg Cabot books and these are ones that I've acquired again. But I think I started with the Princess Diaries, although when I think of Meg Cabot now I don't even think of that series because it's probably her worst books that I've read. But my favourite ones were Avalon High, and I really liked the Mediator series, and literally everything by Meg Cabot I would devour. At one point she was looking for UK ambassadors, which of course are like brand reps, and I actually got to be one. I think I got Jinx in the post, and I also got like bookish goodies and like freebies to give out to other people, and I remember that being really exciting because that was sort of when the internet just started becoming a real thing that people used all the time, and I just filled in this form and actually got this ambassador sort of status, and that was just so exciting to me. But Meg Cabot writes books for sort of, I would say they are YA but younger YA. I just thought that she was amazing and she was my favourite author for a very long time. All the time that this was going on I watched a lot of TV, and I remember watching things with my mum, and something that I watched pretty much from when it came on, so bear in mind that I was 4 at this time, is Buffy the Vampire Slayer, and I was obsessed. I'm actually rewatching it now from the beginning and I still love it so much. And then of course when the spin-off Angel came out I was watching that, and I also used to watch Charmed. And I don't know if you guys will remember, but they also had books that went with the TV shows because they became big franchises, and there was magazines which I collected that had posters in that I put on my walls, and there was also books. I don't own any of these anymore because I've like way grown out of them and they're really terrible books. They're sort of like the Star Wars books that they do now, where they're just like random authors that write installments that sort of go between the episodes. But I read quite a lot of them, if not all, and they were one of those things where because I'd watched the TV show, didn't really matter what order they were in or what order I read them in because I knew like all the context and the backstory of what was going on in the show at the time. I'll insert some pictures of a couple of them here so you can see the kind of books they are, but I really remember reading them. I don't think I thought they were anything amazing apart from that I liked the TV show, but like I said, throughout my younger years it was more just wanting to read something than enjoying what I read. Leading on from that point, I'm not even sure at that age if I discovered things I liked to read or if I just liked the act of reading itself, but then when I was 13 a book came around that changed all that, and that was Twilight by Stephenie Meyer. So you may notice that this is not the cover that you know, and that it's extremely tatty. Like this book is literally falling apart on all sides of the dust jacket because this was before. Oh, it's even falling apart outside of the dust jacket as well, which is really terrible. Essentially what happened is I went to the library once with my mum, as I did, and I found this, and it was in new releases. It was the year that Twilight was released, and I took it out and I absolutely loved it, and I asked her to buy me a copy. So she bought me a copy. Now this is where buying books started for me, really, because I pre-ordered every single Twilight book. Not only did I do that, in the year between Twilight's release and New Moon's release, I read Twilight. I got to the end, I started it again. I got to the end, I started it again. I read these books so many times that I can tell you the exact amount of times I've read this book, and that is 15 times. I've read Twilight 15 times. I've read New Moon 7 times. I've read Eclipse 3 times, and I've read Breaking Dawn just once. I was literally obsessed, and that is how this cover got so destroyed. Also, this cover was the UK cover because they were supposed to be different, and then when New Moon was released, they changed it to the same ones as the US covers, and I was so disappointed. Not because I liked this cover, because I hated it, but because it wouldn't match the one that I had. And that is sort of where caring about how books looked came in, and caring about them matching. But this was such an important part of my life and turned me on to a genre of books and types of books that I actually enjoyed and actually loved, which was kind of new for me because there was only a couple in the hundreds and hundreds of books that I read each year that actually stood out. When I was about 17, my family moved, and they moved to an area with a lot of charity shops. And at this time I was in college, and in college I studied media studies, film studies and English language. I became obsessed with film. It wasn't something that I'd done at school. It was really new. It was really interesting. I was really good at it. And so I let this passion leak into my love for reading, and I started to get book adaptations. So you'll have heard me say in a few videos before that I have a lot of books on my shelves, and I have been unhauling a lot of them recently, that are book to film adaptations that I have no interest in, because at that time in my life I bought all book adaptations I could get second hand, so I could combine the two great loves of my life at the time. If you just glance to my shelf, we have a few here that I still have. We've got Gone Girl, Chocolat down here, Traveling to Infinity, which was a recent purchase. Water for Elephants was bought in those early years. There's also About a Boy that I bought in the early years. I still haven't read that. Marley and Me is another one. And yeah, there's tons of them. Now, I've been unhauling a lot recently, but there are still a couple, like the ones still on my shelves, that I either read and enjoyed, or I haven't read yet, but I'm still kind of interested in. But that took over my life at the time, and that is when my book collection started. These books started around when I was 17, and until that, I had maybe 20 books. I didn't really own books. I went to the library, and that was it. But that is when I started to collect. Okay, so when I was 18, I went to uni, and the really weird thing about going to uni is that I stopped reading. A lot of things were going on in my life then, and at some points I did have a really low mood and just felt shit and didn't really do anything that I enjoyed. But when I came home, I still used to devour books for like in the holidays, where I was off for maybe 2 or 3 weeks, and I would devour everything in that time. But there is one series that I read at uni, actually at uni, in my flat, and they are the only books that I read there, and they would be the Bloodlines books by Rochelle Mead. I had bought the Vampire Academy series secondhand from charity shops. I think the whole series cost me about £3, and I read them, and I fell in love with Adrian Ivashkov, who was in the Vampire Academy series, and then he has his own spin-off books. Now, I think the first 2 maybe were released, and then every year after that, I went out, I bought the book, and I actually read it. So one that I really remember reading at uni is Silver Shadows. That was one that came out while I was actually at uni. These books, to me, at the time, were good enough that even though I didn't read at uni, they were good enough that I had to read them while I was there. And aside from that, I didn't have time. At that time in my life, I was going out drinking a lot. I was watching a lot of TV, like staying up all night, binging it with my flatmates. I was also playing a lot of Call of Duty and a lot of Grand Theft Auto. But I wasn't reading. But these books were important enough to me that I would ignore all the other stuff I normally did and actually sit down and read. So it came to the end of being at uni, and I didn't want to move back home. I wanted to get a job, support myself, and stay in Huddersfield where I went to uni. But unfortunately, that didn't happen. I left it too late. I didn't try hard enough to get a job, and so I couldn't afford to live with my friend who was going into his final year of uni. So because the county where my home is now is a very underfunded rural area with sort of not many job opportunities, miles between each village, it's like predominantly villages, and the towns are all retirement towns and tourist towns. I didn't want to come back here, so I went to live with my best friend and his family for a little while. Now, this was a really difficult time for me because I had no idea what I was doing with my life. I was living in somebody else's house because I didn't know where to go. I didn't have a place, I didn't have a home, and I started reading again. This was 2014, so this was when I joined Goodreads, and this is where I started to read as I do today. Now, I remember it being summer, and I remember my best friend had just read The Fault in Our Stars, and he came in crying and he was like, oh, I just read it and it was so sad. And I was like, right, okay. So all of my books that I'd moved to uni with, because I had bought a few while I was there because there was a really good bookshop that was selling things off at like £1. I had a box at the end of the bed that was full of books, and I just pulled out on a whim The Perks of Being a Wallflower by Stephen Chbosky. I read this in a couple of days, maybe, but this is the first book that's recorded on Goodreads because my friend had discovered Goodreads at that time and he told me to join, and I did, and that is where I really started to read again. The contents of this book are about somebody who's always on the outside looking in, and I can't say that I related to that at the time. I can't say that it changed my life. All I can say is it was a really good book, and it kickstarted my passion to actually read again, which was just amazing. So up until then, the last sort of standout mind-blowing book I had read was Twilight. So I still hadn't found a niche among the books I wanted to read. I was still reading paranormal romance because I remember shortly after The Perks of Being a Wallflower, I read Fallen and absolutely hated it. And I just wasn't enjoying what I was reading. But then a new book came out. I was at Waterstones with my friend just browsing. Didn't have a lot of money at that time. I think I'd just moved back home and I'd got a job. Didn't pay very well, but I'd gone to see my friend in Manchester and we were in Waterstones, and we both picked up a copy of Red Queen by Victoria Aveyard. Now, I've discussed in a video recently that BookTube generally views this book as being tropey and not very good, and just like any other YA book. But to me, it was the first fantasy book I'd read. So the first thing that was in like a medieval type setting or a dystopian setting that was more fantasy than dystopian. So we'll call it my first YA fantasy book. I read this and it completely changed my world. I loved it. I loved it so much, and this is the first author signing I went to, and I had it signed by Victoria Aveyard as To Becca, Flame and Thunder, One Cannot Exist Without the Other, Victoria Aveyard. And this sort of opened my eyes to a new genre, fantasy. Shortly after that, I read A Court of Thorns and Roses by Sarah J. Maas. Now this was the next step up, because like I said about what people on BookTube say about Red Queen, I understand those feelings now. At the time it was really good, but then I read A Court of Thorns and Roses, which is like another notch up on the fantasy scale, and now I see how Red Queen has more flaws than I thought it did, with it being my first sort of foray into the genre. And one of the reasons I love this book so much is because it opened up a little harder fantasy for me. So not quite adult, but not quite YA either. And that's a reason why I love this book. Also, it was one of the first times in a very long time that I had been like really into a love interest. So I really liked that about it. The story at the time was completely different from anything I'd read. I don't think I'd ever read anything about fairies or fae. So that was really eye-opening, and I just really remember loving it. And so now we have where I am today. I read a lot of fantasy, as you can probably see from my shelves, and I'm just a completely different reader than I used to be. I'm sorry that this video is probably very long and I talked a lot longer than I thought I was going to, but I just thought it would be a good video to make, and I really enjoyed planning it because like remembering all the nostalgic times on the books that I'd read. But essentially I feel like really clearly throughout there you can see my evolution as a reader and how I've come to where I am today. My predominant genre is fantasy, and that is why. And I have sort of a love-hate relationship with contemporary, whereas I never want to read them and I'm never interested in them, but I fly through them and really like them. And yeah, that's just a little bit of how I've got to where I am with my reading tastes, and that is all. Please let me know down below if you can think of any pivotal books in your reading journey, and also don't forget to like if you like this video and subscribe if you want to. If you head into the down bar below you can find links to my Instagram, my Twitter and my Goodreads if you'd like to follow me on any of those. But that's everything from me today, and I hope you like this video. Bye!